Welcome back, everyone, to 101 Questions That Church Planters Ask. I'm your host, Danny Parmelee, and today we're going to be asking the question, what might spiritual warfare look like in a church plant? And to help us kind of ask some of those questions, answer some of those questions, we've got Lee Stephenson with us, who is the Executive Director of Church Planting for Converge. So, Lee, thanks so much for joining us today.
Hey, Danny, great to be with you.
And I invited you to kind of speak to this because I've heard your story a number of times, and I think that you have a really good perspective and just some very concrete things. No one wants to be the poster child for
spiritual warfare and that
being
conversation.
being on the experiencing end of spiritual warfare. However, that's one thing that's great about church planting is we can kind of learn from others as they've kind of have gone through that. So why don't you just introduce yourself a little bit, kind of what you do, and maybe even going back, and you can begin to kind of just share your story and also some of those very practical things that church planners should, or categories even that church planners should kind of look for as they're entering into this, maybe even before they've ever even stepped foot on the ground, to be able to kind of, maybe haven't even moved to the city yet. What are some things that they could be aware of?
Yeah, I appreciate it. And it's really is a conversation after that's deep on my heart, because I think we underestimate the spiritual battle when it comes to church planting. And I did when we planted our first church. So my wife and I were both pastors' kids. We've been married now 17 years. We've got 3 kids. So my oldest is 13, 9, and then 4. And we planted our first church plant in Arizona, and specifically it was in Mesa, which has got a huge population of Mormons. And so it was a unique place to plant a church there. And then we moved to Orlando in 2015 to assume the role of kind of helping lead nationally the church planting movement with Converge. But in that process, we just couldn't get away from the local church plant as well. Almost 2 years ago, we actually launched another church here in Orlando. And I can tell you, both situations, we've fought through some massive spiritual battles, and spiritual warfare has been very, very real in those situations. And so I don't want planters, I don't want pastors to be surprised of this conversation. The moment as a planter that you articulate, it's almost like the moment I say out loud, I'm going to plant a church, it's like, you better be ready because now it's coming. Because when you articulate that, you are literally walking into the front lines of the spiritual battle. And it's like you're staking a flag in the ground going, I'm declaring this for Jesus. Well, you better be prepared because the enemy army is going to come after you. You go, oh yeah, well, not so fast, buddy.
So that declaration is basically like putting a big target on your back.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. So be prepared. I say it's not something you need to be afraid of, because you're fulfilling the mission that Christ has given you. I go back to Matthew 28 when he talks about that all authority in heaven and on earth are mine, and then he says, "Go, do these things, lead people to me, baptize them, disciple them," and then he reminds us, "I'm with you." So it's like he gives us the authority by which we're to march with, and then he gives us our marching orders, and he says, "You're not alone." And so it's like, why should we fear when we know that the God that has all authority in heaven and on earth is with us? It's like we've got to press in and have a level of courage, but it doesn't mean it's going to be easy.
Yeah. Now, you often talk about some different kind of categories just to be aware of. So why don't you even just kind of share those off the bat, and then share some of your personal experience, how in each one of those areas you did that?
Yeah, I when we began to play through our story, I tried to begin to categorize what we wrestled through and what are the similarities I see of other pastors sharing or what they're going through and other planters. I really found that there's consistency in 3 areas: that expect to go through a financial hardship, expect to go through a leadership crisis, and then a personal crisis. And so those 3 all have a way of showing up. You're going to have a financial crisis, you're going to have a leadership crisis, you're going to have some type of personal crisis.
And when you say financial crisis, do you mean personal or with the church?
Yes. So it's going to be both and. Ours hit at the same time. We went through for the first time, like our financial crisis didn't hit until in our first church plant until we were about 2 years old. We were doing great, honestly. And then we hit about the 2 year mark, and we had to make a move because we outgrew our facility. I underestimated what change would actually create. And we saw for the first time a group of people leave because now it was like they felt like, I don't want to make the drive. Even though it was a mile down the road, that was an excuse not to come, you know? And we went through our first major financial crisis as a church in that moment. And I can remember in that process, we were going through our first financial hit personally. I had been socked with some medical bills that insurance wasn't going to cover. And I can remember specifically to this day the numbers. Like we had $6,000 in our church bank account, and we were 2 weeks away from making payroll. And at that point, I had 3.5 people on the payroll. And I'm like, we don't have enough money to cover this. Yeah. And then second of all, I had $600 in my personal bank account, and that's everything. Like that's savings, checking, like I had $600. And I can remember crying out to the Lord, like, God, why did you bring us to the breach of the desert to let us die of dehydration? Like
literally in Arizona.
Like that's literally how I felt. And, God walked us through, humbled me in some areas of my life that I'm thankful for, learned a lot, but it was very real.
I want to jump in there too, of two things. So you said you were moving from one facility to the next because of growth. So I'm assuming this is a rental facility, school.
We were in a movie theater.
You were in a movie theater, and then you have an opportunity because you are growing, and you're just thinking, this is awesome. We're killing it. We're growing, and you're basing your projections off this. So now all of a sudden you move into this, new facility, and you have people leave, and you're thinking that is the craziest thing. We're on this huge wave of momentum, and now people are peeling off. And so there's this kind of financial thing. You said that God taught you some things. I'm assuming that some of that was when things start going really, really well. I think it opens, this is my personal thing, it opens us up to a spiritual attack, even spiritual warfare. And maybe it's not spiritual warfare. Maybe it's just our own sinful nature where pride gets in there. And all of a sudden we start making decisions based off of thinking that we're pretty good. Now, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but speak to that a little.
Well, I think you have, you feel safe, and so there is a confidence of like, hey, we're beyond sinking at this point. I think we're going to make it. We did have momentum. Like we had everything that you would look at. We were at 2 services on a Sunday morning in a movie theater, and we literally couldn't get any more people in. And so it was like, how are we going to do this? We were in the biggest movie theater, like the theater room that they would allow us to be in. It just wasn't, we couldn't go to 3. That was impossible. There was a high school a mile down the road that had plenty of room, and everybody knew where it was. Let's just move there. And so I felt like this is a no-brainer. I still to this day don't wrestle. I think it was still the right decision.
Yeah.
But I underestimated the hardship it would create. Yeah. The thing that I learned the most was don't be timid in my leadership. In those moments, I had to lead the church through that crisis, not just assume that God would bail us out of it.
Okay.
And that was probably the biggest lesson I learned, was how do you embrace the crisis and how do you lead through the crisis? And crisis can actually be a great gift to what God wants to release in the life of the church and even in you personally, if you lean into him. I had to revisit some of that, and God taught me some lessons when it came to just my own personal leadership that I'm thankful for in this season.
So that's great. The other thing that you said with spiritual warfare was actual leadership stuff. So I don't know if you have other examples where, and again, I think this one is so touchy. So I'd love for you to just speak to this of how, when we think of a spiritual warfare and a person, we think of, someone's going to walk into the church and they've got horns and a Marilyn Manson t-shirt. Sorry, Marilyn Manson fans and whatever. They're going to start casting spells on you. Is that what you mean by leadership crisis?
It could happen that way, but that's not been the way it's played out in my world. Usually they're insiders. Find some of the most difficult leadership situations and leadership crises have been created by other Christians or pseudo Christians. So at least what I mean is they know the talk, or they're immature in what it means to walk by faith and to trust God in those processes, and they can completely derail things. That you've worked really hard, and they'll even question your character in that process. I found that most of those leadership crises do turn personal towards the main leader, and so you just kind of almost have to prepare yourself for that. We walked through all three crises in our first church plant at the same time. So we were walking through a financial crisis where I had medical bills piled up. One of the medical procedures I had to have done at 2.5 years old into our church left me 12 weeks bedridden. I was not at the helm, hooked up to a machine for 12 hours a day, staring at the ceiling, watching Netflix, and in that process, I had $23,000 of now medical bills I had to pay that we didn't have the money for. And in that time, I had an elder come after me, and I'm not even present. And he tries to persuade the elder board against me in that time period. And it was really over something absolutely ridiculous. But he thought he was right. And I was like, that was brutal in our season of walking through that. And I really felt like I had no control. I have to trust the Lord. I got to trust the other leaders around me. And all I could do is get on my knees and pray and just trust that God would guide us through that. The second church plant, similarly, before we even got off the ground, I had a major issue where I had one of the guys that we were bringing on our team as a next gen pastor came to me 2 months before our grand opening and admitted to having an affair. And it's like, how do you handle that? And, right. Everything we vetted, I vetted him more than any hire I've ever vetted a hire in my life. And it seemed golden. But it snuck in, and that could have easily, before we even got our grand opening off the ground, could have derailed us. And so hidden sin has a way of festering and showing up, and you just need to be prepared for those.
So when you were in those moments, did you recognize it as spiritual warfare? Is kind of a two-part question. In the midst of it, did you recognize it? And then second, how do you, I guess, discern or determine what is spiritual warfare without thinking the devil's underneath every single rock and, assigning the devil or spiritual warfare to absolutely everything that happens?
Yeah, I think the first time around in our first church plant, I didn't see it as spiritual warfare right away. I think it was something in hindsight that I began as I was processing it, or at the tail end of some of the crisis that I began to put it together. Second time around, I saw it a whole lot faster. And knew what it was. And I really think it comes down to where Paul reminds us that the battle is not against flesh and blood, but it's against the principalities of darkness in this world, And so I had to remind myself, even when I'm having conversations that are hard and people are upset or they're caught in sin, and we confronted that sin in a gracious, truth-filled way, as Christ-like as we could be, and they still get upset. I had to realize, my battle really isn't against that person. There's something underlying here that's taking place that I need to be cognizant of and respectful of, but I don't need to live in fear of. And you still do what is right. You still speak truth. You still walk by grace. You follow the examples of Christ in that, and you have to approach it with deep prayer. There's no doubt. I mean, my guess is you had seasons too. I remember coming out from preaching and having a guy confront me on the front porch where I literally thought he was going to try to deck me. Right. So sometimes you see that in that moment, you're tired, you just got done preaching your third time or whatever it is, and things are coming at you. But sometimes they're much more subtle in the way that they approach as well.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things, especially the leadership area, is it is really easy to demonize people, and sometimes to be able to separate that and to know that sometimes they're being used as a tool. It's not that they are the devil incarnate in front. And sometimes it feels like that, especially if it's you have a leader, or you add to that a leader and a close friend, and you're thinking, oh my goodness, this person is stabbing me in the back. Like, I can't believe it. But sometimes they're so even unaware of those different things, and to be able to kind of slow it down, take a deep breath, and to go to prayer. The other thing that I would say is to be proactive in spiritual warfare, and that is through prayer, inviting other people, and fasting. And so maybe it is just having a little bit of that spiritual awareness, as you said, of the different things that are going on, and at the same time having it somewhat balanced so that you're not, again, assigning everything to spiritual warfare. And then the final thing is just recognizing that sin is sin, and some things are just a result of sinful things that are happening. And we just, again, so much of it is self-leadership, that we've got to put ourselves in a place where we're able to kind of sort, separate, and then to be able to lead not only ourselves through it, but our leaders, our launch team, and then the congregation as well.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's so important to have people that you can trust walking with you, that you can just say, hey, I'm not feeling great and I need you to pray. Like that in itself can carry you through these seasons in remarkable ways too.
Yeah. My one last little thing, as I, coach church planners and stuff, is to not use spiritual warfare as an excuse when you make your mistakes. So when you, when you overspend on something, or you treat someone poorly and they leave the church, that's not spiritual warfare. That's you being an idiot, being a dumb idiot. And that's the reason. And your best antidote to that is to confess, repent, learn from it, and
stay humble.
Stay humble during that time. So, well, Lee, thank you so much for just kind of sharing a bit of your experience. And what is neat is that as you navigated that, you saw growth and growth upon growth, and to continue to see God doing that, and God is still working in all of our churches, and is clearly working in your church plant as well too. So thanks so much for just taking some time, kind of sharing with planters. And thanks everybody for listening. Remember, if you have a question about church planting, you can head over to the blog at churchplantersask.com. You can leave your question there. And until next time, keep asking those questions.